Hello, everyone. I'm going to talk about kind of a serious subject today, saving democracy, one story at a time. So I was kind of an unusual kid. I realize that now. From the age of 12, I pretty much knew what I wanted to do with my life. I wanted to be a reporter. I was putting out my Girl Scout newsletter, and I loved knowing things before everybody else and telling my world about them. When I went to high school and college, I learned there was a much more serious side to journalism. Many of my classmates were being drafted to go to the Vietnam War, and two incredible journalists, Woodward and Bernstein, were doing the most powerful kind of journalism, the kind of journalism that caused a president to resign. When I got out of college, I had some options. I could be in a newspaper, I could go to a television station, or I could maybe work for a wire service. I chose newspapers. I love to write. I loved my front seat on the world. I love to witness history and write the first version of history. I worked for 5 newspapers, most recently the Union Tribune right down the street. I covered some incredible stories. I witnessed one of the last gas chamber executions in the state of California. I covered a political campaign that took me to Australia. And when I was an editor at the Union Tribune, my reporters helped bring down a congressman who was accused of taking bribes from a government contractor. That congressman went to prison, and the Union Tribune won a Pulitzer. But I can't say that I loved my job forever. There came a moment, actually a string of moments, in 2008 when the recession was raging and newspapers were crashing around me. The thing I loved was crashing. They were laying people off, newspapers were closing, and almost overnight, my job at the newspaper became less about journalism and more about figuring out who should be laid off next in the newsroom. Let me tell you a little bit about newspapers. Newspapers have been fat and happy for more than 100 years. There was a time when if you wanted to sell a car, you wanted to get a job, you wanted to buy a sofa, you wanted to read the news, you had to buy a newspaper. Newspapers had captive audiences. They sometimes made double-digit profits. So in the 1990s, when the internet came flying in, newspapers either didn't see it coming or they didn't take it seriously, in my observation. Suddenly, if you wanted a job or you wanted to buy a car, or you wanted to sell a sofa, or you wanted to read the news, you could do it on the internet for free. You didn't need those classified ads anymore, those ads that were the cash cow. Suddenly, the cash cow was pretty much gone. So let me take you back to 2008 when I was feeling pretty bad about my job. I was really rather panicked. I was trying to figure out how I was going to be able to continue doing the kind of journalism that had fueled me since I was a kid. Accountability journalism, investigative journalism, the kind of journalism that was going to help all of you better practice democracy and make your lives better. And how was I going to do that outside the mainstream, which was disintegrating around me? Well, I looked around the country, and I had a colleague who managed to get a $100,000 grant to start a nonprofit newsroom in Wisconsin, the Wisconsin Center for Investigative Journalism. I can't tell you how many hours Andy spent on the phone with me telling me how he planned to make this work. And I thought, I can do this. And then I had an equal number of people whispering in my ear that you really don't want to start a nonprofit because if you do, you're going to spend all your time raising money and not really doing journalism. But I thought, no, that can't be the case. If you do good work, if you do good, strong journalism, people will give you money. And I wasn't alone in that thinking. Turns out, in June 2009, 27 of us gathered in a conference room at Pocantico. This was the Rockefellers' estate outside New York City that was now a conference center. And we sat down to talk about this phenomenon called nonprofit journalism. And there was a passion in that room that echoed what I was feeling, and I call it the Scarlett O'Hara moment. You remember the movie Gone with the Wind? And you remember that scene when Scarlett O'Hara is down in the dirt, clawing at the dirt, and she pulls a root out of the ground, and she takes a bite out of it, and the sky is on fire behind her, and she thrusts her fist in the air and says, "As God is my witness, I'll never go hungry again." That was me. That was the people in that room. That is the passionate feeling that people have who want to right a wrong, who want to fill a horrible void, who want to start a business that's going to do great public service. So I came home from New York to San Diego, and I took a giant leap of faith in myself and in my community. And I quit my job at the Union Tribune, cold, and I started a nonprofit investigative journalism organization now called inewsource. I taught investigative journalism at San Diego State, right down the way here, in trade for my reporters getting office space. And I have to say, I probably didn't do the greatest job at the negotiation because the room they got was long, narrow, and windowless. And 3 of them spent most of their time climbing over each other, but I can tell you they did some great journalism in that room. And we got our start in this nonprofit world with money actually from the Union Tribune. Interestingly enough, they thought it was a good idea that I start a nonprofit, and we would do investigative journalism that they could continue publishing in the Union Tribune. So this went on not really very long. It wasn't long before the money dried up, and I found myself in a position of having to lay off one of my reporters, and I didn't take a paycheck for quite a number of months. But you know, I think it was that Scarlett O'Hara passion that maybe was blinding me or keeping me going, but it never occurred to me that I should shut inewsource down. I felt like surely the community is going to see the need for this. Surely our journalism is going to resonate. And sure enough, I applied for a grant and I got the first one, and then I got the second one. And then we forged a partnership with KPBS, Public Media, here on campus, where we give them our content, our investigative content, to air on television, radio, and the web. So this was giving us great exposure. The community was listening to us. The community was seeing our value. But the damage had been done. The Pew Research Center says that between 2008 and 2017, nearly 25% of all newsroom jobs have been lost across media organizations. And at newspapers, it has been most critical. 45% of newsroom jobs have been lost in newspapers between 2008 and 2017. Many of those people who lost those jobs are people who do what I call original reporting. Many of them were investigative reporters who excelled at figuring out how to root out vice and corruption and hold the powerful to account. These people were experienced and also expensive, which meant they were expendable. So the good news is, in all of this, that nonprofit newsrooms are actually increasing. In the same time period, 2008 to 2017, the Pew Research Center reported that nonprofit newsrooms had expanded 79%. You might think that sounds really great, but in all honesty, the numbers are pretty small compared to the numbers of people who have lost their jobs. That doesn't mean we've lost hope. The nonprofit news is a movement. It's an actual movement. You remember when I told you that there were 27 of us around that table in 2009? Today, there are more than actually 200 nonprofit newsrooms in this country in a span of 10 years. Some of them are big, well-funded newsrooms. Most are pretty small. Some are 1- and 2-person newsrooms where they probably eat a lot of rice and beans for dinner and maybe lunch and breakfast too, trying to cover the communities that have all but been abandoned by traditional media. They are speaking truth to power for you. They are trying to save democracy one story at a time. Let me give you a couple examples. Do you remember the Panama Papers a few years ago? More than 11 million records were released anonymously and covered by scores of news organizations across the globe. And these papers showed how rich and powerful people were, in essence, sheltering their assets, sometimes illegally. That collaboration was headed up by a nonprofit news organization. Some of you might remember a story a few years ago about who was staying in the Lincoln bedroom in the White House and what kind of favors might have been exacted for that access. Nonprofit news. And here at home, inewsource has done many stories that have changed laws and changed lives. Just an example, last year, we investigated a series of diabetes clinics where the founder was promising people a miraculous a miraculous method for reversing complications of diabetes. He was also promising that Medicare and the insurance companies would pay for it. Not so much. So this man who started these clinics was indicted in Alabama last year, and our investigation was aired nationally on the PBS NewsHour. So today, we seem to be pretty consumed with the rhetoric, right? Fake news, alternative facts, enemy of the people. It's not the first time in history the media has been attacked or challenged, particularly by people at the highest levels of government. But today it seems a bit more insidious. News travels so fast, and people are doubting. They're uncertain about what to believe. They're not even certain they should believe organizations that are credible, fact-based organizations. And this kind of feeling threatens democracy and our ability to practice democracy. Let me ask you, think about what you consider reliable information. And then imagine a world where you have a couple of choices. You can watch cable news shows, basically with what I call screaming men and women in chairs. Or maybe you can watch the late night comedians making fun of politicians and issues that you really care about. That makes great television, but it doesn't do much for informing your life or giving you valuable information that you can act on in your daily life or at the ballot box. So I have an idea. I was going to bring you journalists today, the real people who give you news. Because one of the problems we have in nonprofit and for-profit journalism is that people believe news is free. They believe that it just kind of occurs on the internet. It kind of shows up in their news feed. And we've actually have a couple generations of people that we've trained to think that news is free. And it's hard to convince people that they should pay for something that they've had for free for so long. So in bringing these journalists to you today, I would like you to take a look at them. And as much as you can, look them in the eye, look at their expressions, and really know that these are real people working really hard for you. These are the people out there getting the facts, crunching the data, and bringing it all back, fact-checking it, and making sure that you have important information that can inform your life. So the next time you look at your news feed and you look at your free news, think about these real people. And in conclusion, I'd like to give you some ideas. Think about subscribing to a newspaper online. Think about giving a donation to a nonprofit news organization. Or as a start, think about calling up, sending an email, or direct messaging on Twitter, a reporter whose story you really liked and you really felt like was important to you. Because you know what? They would love to hear from you. I can tell you from experience, they would love to hear from you. Because the work they're doing is all about you and for you, saving democracy one story at a time. Thank you.